All right, it's time for our closing dialogue on capacity building and leadership. I'm thrilled to welcome our guest, Vidya Bhushan IIHS. Vidya Bhushan is now the Managing Director at Poorvanchal Vidyut Vitaran Nigam. Prior to that, he served as the Deputy Director at the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration for 4 years. He is an experienced administrator who has worked in the field level administration, urban governance, social sector program administration, and the human resources management. He has the unique distinction of being a UPP faculty, Urban Practitioners Program faculty and learner, in addition to being a master trainer himself, designing courses for administrators themselves as the Deputy Director of Labasna. And welcome, Vidya. Now, Manish Dubey, the Chief of Practice at IIHS, will anchor this dialogue. Manish is a governance and institutional development expert with over 2 years of consulting experience with national and state governments, multilateral and bilateral development partners, INGOs, and philanthropies. Key areas of Manish's work include institutional design and strengthening, program design and strategy, reform management support, strategic stakeholder communication, and sector portfolio and program level result management. Over to you, Manish and Vidya.
Am I on mute?
Yes, now.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Ashwari. Hi, Vidya, and hi, all those who are joining. Nice to be here. So let me just wade into this. A few years ago, I read something. This was on this was a piece on what they called the Great Training Robbery. Robbery was a bit of a clickbait thing. It would probably be called the Great Training Waste. But what the article essentially said, and there was some merit in what it said, was that capacity building efforts in American corporations, they were spending up to $80 billion a year at that point of time. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. But capacity building efforts that were going in were not yielding the results that they were expected to. And why were they not able to deliver as expected? Was because when people went back to their institutions, they just didn't get the flexibility, the support. Sometimes the departments did not have the mandate. They got locked in institutional processes and so on, and the whole effort got wasted. This was pretty damaging, but there's an element of truth in it. It's somewhat harsh, but it's still out there. And I was just wondering, Vidya, with your experience of having seen through some of the brightest minds go into the civil service, into public systems, what your reflections are on this overall thing.
Thank you, Manish. Thank you, Aishwarya, for the kind introduction of mine. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is not an easy question to handle. Having worked in this capacity building arena for some time, I think it's a very, very valid concern that all of us have. All of us are working this area. So I would start by qualifying this statement a bit, even at the cost of being defensive, sounding defensive at least. See, we look at the results of capacity building programs, and we sometimes feel that the anticipated results are not forthcoming. We find that there is a gap between what we want to achieve in the institutional setup and what we really go on to achieve, and how it pans out when we go to field level practice, whereby we are trying to implement some of the fruits of the capacity building program. But why I'm qualifying this statement is the simple reason that this capacity building program that we're talking, as we were listening from the previous speakers, Chandrika, all the people, and I was also looking at the panels in the morning about theory of change by Deepak Saran sir. And so we went through a wide span of, let's say, different ways in the capacity building happens. So The reason I'm qualifying the statement that anticipated results are there or not is that because that capacity building is a term which is very diverse. Diverse kind of pedagogy, areas wide, sectoral. Then trainings being done in different setup, government, private, NGO. I've heard of training such as a training, very interesting kind of training, which is again by a person who was in services, crossed over, and now the person is into NGO sector. So he does something called Sodh Yatra every year. So his method of training is that we together will go to the grassroots and then try to look at ways in which we can reach out to people, understand them, learn from them, and teach them. So he goes around into the rural hinterlands and tries to find different innovative ways to solve the problems and trying to institutionalize them into a way of learning, training, and implementation. So yes, some of the training program works, some of them doesn't work. Having qualified the statement, I would see that I would admit that in my experience of training, which has a very different and diverse kind of people, I have delivered the foundation program, biggest ever, almost 400 people coming from 20 services, young, energetic, bright people, people who are have a lot of, let's say, enthusiasm, a lot of skepticism also about how the country is going and how we are going to kind of play a role into all of this. A lot of apprehension also, and yet very diverse group. Then we also have something called Joint Civil Military Program. Again, people from three different emerging parts, from military, from police services, from administrative services. They come together and have a deliberation. Then we have people from different countries coming in. So I've seen very diverse set of training and also in terms of seniority also. But I've always found, and I would admit that without any hesitation, that there has been gaps. There has been gaps into the capacity building program in terms of what we are trying to build and how it is being implemented at the ground level. And the part of my role into academy, Masuri Academy, is that I am also counselor to a lot of young people who are going to districts for their practical training. So I interact with them very closely. We speak very often. It's a kind of mentorship, kind of one-to-one mentorship kind of role. That's again a part of a way of capacity building. So then I asked them, well, we taught you something about CRPC, for example, or something about how the legal system works. How do you find it at the ground level? They said, sir, आप जो पढ़ाते हो और जो कोर्ट में होता है, there's a huge difference. Court may we get maybe a minute a case, 1 minute, and you have to kind of decide on a case, or maybe 2 minutes to decide a case. We have 80 cases lined up in one afternoon, and you want us to, you have taught me how to do a speaking order, a regent order, the principles of natural justice and all. So it's a very different thing in terms of how it's being taught and how practical it is in the field. Of course, the job is very complex, and certainly it's not easy to kind of replicate the needs and cater to the needs in a very perfect scenario. Similarly, there is also a poor understanding, or let's say gap in understanding about what is the need, what is the felt need, training need assessment, and what is being delivered. So that also is a difficult issue. When I went back to each course that I designed in the Masuri Academy, I went to previous 2-3 batches and asked them as to how they found it, how they were working it, and what worked, what didn't work. So I always came back with the realization that yes, we probably do not understand it fully. Also, there are a lot of barriers that, again, this, for example, technology is a barrier. It's enabler, but it's a barrier as well for many people. I have every year at least 8 to 10 people who are differently abled in my training program. Now they perceive technology very differently. Now let's say a very well designed PowerPoint presentation is not something that somebody would able to use who is visually challenged. Similarly, there are people with different kind of needs. So all these gaps and barriers are there. However, how do we respond to it? What do we do? So I believe that there has to be a way of making the organization or the institution more fertile, something which can give more enabling conditions for training. And we need to understand it better. And in this, there are two separate or two distinct things which come into play. One is the institutional mandate. What is my real mandate? What is that I want to train for? What is the outcome that I'm looking at? Is there some kind of, let's say, pathway which has been created, which I have to follow? That's one thing. And second aspect, again, sometimes people say it is useful. It is something which is very, very crucial, is the leadership being given by the person. And I always find myself difficult to explain as to how these both things, the individual leadership into an organization who is into capacity building, and the institutional mandate or institution itself, how do they interact and come together to give a good training landscape? So that's something, in fact, I will ask Manish back if he's from his wide experience can throw some light into it as to how these two factors come together to provide a atmosphere of training which is enabling, which can let's address those gaps and barriers that I was talking about into training. And probably then we can talk about not the great training rivalry, but something which is enabling, which is something which is really useful, something which you can take back and really work on. Manish, over to you.
Thanks. No, sure. So no, I get what you're saying. Essentially, that capacity building efforts do make a difference, do prep people for the sort of real world and what they're likely to encounter out there. But the learnings are not always realized on ground because of a mix of factors, which is basically the fertile conditions within the institution, and the sort of and therefore the role of leadership in enabling that. As to your question of unpacking it, now that's a tough one. I'm just trying to think through this, and maybe one way to look at it is to look at the mission structures that have been created over the years. There is an institutional issue with them, and that's separate for the moment. There's another set of fundamental issues there. But just focusing on the mission structures and the fact that in the public system, they do offer a certain level of flexibility, latitude, etc., things that are not there in the mainstream system in a sense to individuals. By and large, I've seen that capacity building efforts in such missions are far more structured, A. B, that individuals tend to perform better than they were because of the conditions within the mission structure than they were back in their parent departments in some ways. Now, unpacking this into the leadership and the institutional factors, I would say leadership has a crucial role to play here, because if you look at the mission structures and say that rural livelihood missions, all the health missions and so on, many of them with similar operating contexts, with similar rules, with similar mandates, have delivered different levels of performance, and it's largely been driven by the leaders. So there's clearly a role that the leadership has played. I've also seen missions where a certain kind of leadership drove the mission well. And then when that leadership moved on and another came in, things went back into some sort of a shell. So clearly there is a leadership. Leadership is a key factor there, and as part of the enabling condition, sure, but the leadership matters.
Manish, I fully agree with you that leadership is a very important question. But again, unpacking this particular term leadership, that's also very important. I clearly remember another program, the fellowship program by IIHS that I went through, whereby there's a lot of discussion about leadership and various styles of leadership. We had a very interesting session on this. And I always go back to it in terms of how do we understand leadership and what makes a great leader? What is that which will differentiate a person or leader from a great leader? So that's a question which always kind of needs to be understood into the context. So coming back to this context, whereby we're trying to create a good leadership for a capacity building institution or for this such kind of program, Again, can I ask you back as to what is your view about some of the impactful leaders that you have seen? What kind of differentiates them? What comes to your mind in terms of what are some of the crucial things that they have used, or they have the quality that they have, which they've employed over time to create a very good institution itself?
So, I mean, top of the mind, there are three things that I have seen the more impactful leaders do. One is how they frame a particular problem or a particular challenge or a particular mandate internally within the institution. So, for example, a water pipeline delivering water to a village or a city is not simply a water pipeline, but a way to give a basic service that has eluded people for many years. Sanitation is about dignity. They frame the challenge in a larger sort of perspective. And that's a big motivation sort of factor for the people who work alongside them. The second thing that I've seen them is, and all of us have a little bit of vanity, so they might not actually publicly concede this, but being respectful of domain expertise within their team as well. So it might not come across as such, it might not come across in a public interaction, but in sort of more closed settings, they would be extremely respectful of what colleagues with domain expertise are saying. They would hear them out, they would try to understand what is being said, and at the heart of it, realize the recognition that I might not be a domain expert, but there are people out there who are better at this subject, but I have got the perspective, and I've got the, in a sense, I've got the perspective to put this all together and make things forward. And I've got the self-mandate in some ways to do that. But the most crucial thing, if you ask me, I mean, this is the third factor that I could think of, and this is probably the most crucial thing that I have seen leaders do, the more impactful leaders, like you said, do, is they are very, they have been very indulgent of mistakes. When colleagues make mistakes, they might be reprimanded for sure. Sometimes there might be some harsh thing, but they are forgiving of them. They realize that people make mistakes. As long as there is no pattern to it, they are okay with it. In public, in the presence of other colleagues, they back the person who's made the mistake. And that's a thing that to me has been one of the most outstanding qualities of some of the better leaders that I have met. But even now, as I'm saying this, it's also occurring to me that, this is probably too much of an ask for ordinary mortals. And also, I'm cognizant of the fact that many institutions have bosses, though not necessarily leaders. I mean, I'm just trying to distinguish between the two. I have people at the steering wheel, let's say, in leadership positions, who are ordinary mortals, who will probably struggle to do all these things. And I'm just wondering, can leaders actually be trained? Can you train a leader? I mean, it goes back in some ways to the whole nature versus nurture debate and so on. Can leaders be trained? Or at least, are there certain, I'm not even talking about values and so on, I'm just talking about day-to-day things that, or people can be taught in some ways to practice so that they become more effective in their steering wheel positions. Any sort of thoughts on that, Vidya?
Yes, Manish. Yeah, apparently that's a question that we have been trying to address in our academy and a lot of places. That's a huge debate which happened. So what happens that I did mention about the leadership program that I went through, part of IIHS. We at Mussoorie Academy have a very well-established and graded set of modules on leadership development. So let's say basic leadership skills, then mezzanine, and then advanced leadership skills. It's a workshop kind of thing whereby we try to go through a process and try to, let's say, make people more aware and to get into some kind of leadership. Basically, ask that people from civil services have, at least in theory, is that you provide a leadership position in spite of the constraints that we have at the field level. And all officers, irrespective of services, the 20 services that I was talking about, whether he works in railways or he works in accounts or works in trade service or foreign service or police service, they are supposed to give a leadership position, occupy leadership position. And I have seen people struggle. I have seen people being also criticized that you have not been able to deliver effectively as leaders. So that's something that question gets asked from us. As an academy, what are you doing? It's something that you can really do something. I remember a comment by Honorable Prime Minister also when he came to Missouri Academy. He made a simile with the process whereby we try to build Kumhar. He was talking about how we mold to create earthen pots. He said that कि ये तो बने रहते हैं. What can you do to mold their character, leadership, values? That's something which probably is not easy. Definitely, it's very, very difficult. So can you do it? Can you really do it? So that's a question that we have struggled a lot. And we have certain process. I'm not sure whether it is really worked or not, but we have a certain process that we go through. But before I go and dwell into that, it's a question in which almost everybody has a stake. All capacity building institutions, everybody is part of panel or part of audience have a stake. They all are leaders in their own position. They have acquired leadership role. They have learned, or they were innate leaders. The question that you asked. So that's something that they experience in their life. So probably I would like to kind of open up for a couple of questions on or reflections on this particular issue of how do we create leaders? How do we look at leaders? Or can the leadership be created at all? So if we can get certain responses from the audience, if they want to kind of ask or maybe comment on this, and then probably I can come back and share some of the things that we are doing at the Missouri Academy, or I've seen people doing in the field also, whereby people have led different institutions, be it a municipality or development authority, or be it a department or directorate in state government, and what made them a better leader, what or was there learning on the job, or did we do something about it? So I can go into that question, but before that, as you also mentioned, that one of the important aspects is to be able to listen, to be open to learning. So I'll probably like to open up to some questions, some comments from the audience as to what are their thoughts on this particular aspect. Yes.
So if participants of the audience have any reflections on this, you can raise your hands, please. Okay. So no raised hands at the moment, Vidya, so you can continue with your response, and as and when the questions and the reflections come in, we'll pick them up.
We have one question to the
Box, is it?
One question into the question box. So
yes,
basically it says that, yes, we that's what called nurturing future leaders, or basically we're saying the role of psychology in imparting capacity building program. Yes, if I have to kind of respond to this question, or Manish, would you like to respond to this question?
please go ahead. I think it's pretty much in line with what you were saying. So, yeah,
so this role of psychology in this program, that's something which is central to, in the sense that what I have found that people come with different, let's say, educational, cultural, social background, which has shaped their identity, their mental makeup. And that's something when we talk about our capacity building program, we talk about attitudes, behaviors, and competencies. So the attitudinal part, the whole attitudinal part is something which we give a lot of importance. That is most difficult to kind of mold, but that's most crucial also. So that is where the role of psychology comes in. We employ a lot of interesting methods to kind of get people to look back upon themselves, how their psychology has been built up over time, what are their biases that they've come up with. So one of the exercises that we do is the exercise in empathy. So we create, let's say, situations whereby something called power walk. That's people have seen. So we give them a set of questions and we put them into a line, straight line to begin with. And the certain questions when they respond to, those questions, either they move up or move back. And then we tell them how you begin together. That's probably signifies that you're born together. And with time, depending upon your conditions, you came to a certain position. So some of the questions could be, can you read a newspaper? Or questions could be, can you ride alone in a transportation? Or can you go to a party? Or can you, let's say, make independent financial choices? Or let's say if you are a person who is working at a brick kiln, you are a brick kiln worker. Do you think that you can send your child to school? So people respond to different questions and they have an assigned role. In sense, they have assigned identity, which has been given to them, which is known only to them. And they respond from their point of view. It's very interesting exercise, very powerful. It's open up their mind. We also have something called power, whereby we suppose blindfold people and take them through the whole campus. And then they realize that, yeah, it's not something that I had the empathy to begin with. We try to expose them to survivors, acid attack victims. And then when they speak, or people coming from different parts of people who were trafficked. So these kind of things, then we try to go into this thing, go into the psychology of people, try to open up their mind, forcing them to introspect. That has probably made a difference. And why I say they have made a difference, because again, I can cite one example. So we went to this whole gender module. We started, I designed, me and my better half actually, we both of us designed this gender module in Masuri Academy. We went, took them through this experiential journey. And next year, I was so happy to see one of our students going ahead, going to Kerala, picking up around 30, 40 schools and creating gender neutral uniforms for them. They say that that's where the gender biases or gender discrimination starts. So they applied those, let's say, empathy that they learned in the course, and it helped them create something, some enabling environment. So I feel they're a very, very important, let's say, aspect. You want to add something?
No, I was just wondering if there are individuals in the audience who would like to weigh in on the leadership development question from their own experience of running similar programs. There's a question meanwhile from Anutama, I think.
Anutama, I cannot see the question. If I...
Oh, okay. You want me to read it out to you? It says that, do you think self-generating agency and the power to make a change distinguish a leader from a follower?
Yeah, that's again a very, very important aspect, I would say. See, agency, the question of agency, that becomes crucial. And that is linked to the, let's say, you're being able to empathize, have the compassion, being able to understand a person. In most cases, what we have, in fact, traditionally, that was something that we followed a lot. When we were teaching them just the law or teaching them the schemes, programs, those were things that we were doing at Masudi Academy for quite some time. But then we realized that, well, we are being too paternalistic in our roles. When we do go out and work and we want to make some change, the change has to be something which is organic. We should be able to give agency to people whom we are serving. They should be able to demand services. So if you're talking in urban context, why shouldn't they have the agency to bring in a certain change into the way our open spaces are organized? Something in the way our transportation is being conceived, something in the way our night shelters are being done. So once we start giving agency to people, that changes fundamentally the way we are governing. That has also happened in the case of training and capacity building per se. So again, I will, we do not have much time, but I will just try to bring one very small example. So one of the very boring capacity building or training sessions that we used to have was two things: the basic principles of economics and statistics. So statistics is something that I have graduated into. I used to teach that, and people used to say, "Ki bahut boring hai, it has absolutely no use. You are just telling us how to beat data to accept anything that you want to. You're just trying to dress up. There is no use per se when we go to field. There was not much of buy-in. We experimented with a lot of different methods, including online methods, including some kind of blended learning approaches. Wasn't working too well. Same was true for economics. Then we said, well, let's flip it. Let's give the onus to them. Let's give the agency. Am I audible?
Yes,
I think I was cut out a bit.
No, that's all right. Now you're back.
So I hope I was there whereby we were trying to flip the classes of economics and statistics. Is that something which was audible to everybody?
Yes, it was.
So we tell them that if you have to design this, if you have to be our co-designer for this course, if you want to teach together, how do we do it? Fortunately, we have a lot of wonderful minds, people coming from Indian Economic Services. They had wonderful ideas. They have worked in field for some time. Some of them have worked on Niti Aayog, some of them worked at different NGOs. They're doing a lot of practical work in economics. Same was the case with the statistics. And then they came up. They said, we will design it. And then we started working them. We gave them the onus. They did so wonderfully well. We could create very small groups. So people from IIHS who often come to Masuri Academy, they said, I particularly remember Gautam Khan. So he will always say, Masuri aane ka matlab hota hai stage par perform karna padta hai. So you have 300 people listening to you in one class. How do you teach them? So that's a huge problem that we used to have. But with this model, whereby we could give agency of creating or demanding a particular type of training or input to the trainees themselves, then they came up with solutions and we could individualize the training. We could create different groups depending upon learning levels. We could create very small groups, and the whole capacity building and the training satisfaction improved dramatically. So that's my response to this particular question.
So I'll just come in on Anantama's question as well. It's an interesting question. How do you distinguish a leader from a follower? Can we just shut this window, please? Yeah. So 2-3 things, I suppose. One is a passion to address a situation or a problem. Second, the realization that this problem can be addressed, but it cannot be addressed by the individual alone, and therefore needs mobilization of a larger set of groups and constituencies. 3, the foresight and the sort of and the persuasive skills to actually get that mobilization done. So if you were to ask me what are those three things that would distinguish a leader from a follower, those would be the 3 things. There was another question about outsourcing of functions and all that. I'm not too sure how this links to the. Sorry.
Yeah, but it's very interesting question per se, because why I would like to come in here is that this builds to the whole ecosystem of capacity building that's there into the government as of now. So we have Honorable Prime Minister has launched a very ambitious program that's called Mission Karm Yogi, whereby a lot of capacity building is moving on demand online based on a competency framework. We are creating, they're doing competency mapping for different roles that we have, and then they're trying to create small bite-sized programs online. So all of the central training institutions, IPS, IAS, all services, they came together and we had a series of discussions and we wanted to create content. And we did go for the outsourcing model where we were talking about. And I absolutely agree. Outsourcing is not going to give you results at all if you do not engage with the agency completely, fully as an equal partner. What has happened most of the times that they come from a context which is completely different from your training concept. You have to understand your training needs. You should be able to create the content per se. Their role comes into the, let's say, making it more presentable. or giving you more tools to, let's say, analyze the results or engagement issues that can be handled by them as to how do we make it more engaging? How do we look at that whole training data which is coming in and how do we analyze it, find out where are the gaps? So those things are happening. But otherwise, I created a module on urban, I created a module on gender, I created a module on some of the laws in this thing. So I felt that whenever I kind of didn't involve myself fully, it was some kind of job whereby the needs of my trainees were not addressed. It was something which was not demand-led, but supply-led. Most of this content creation is supply-led, and that's true for also most of the capacity building programs, unfortunately. That's the reason I thought it is pertinent. It's not the question with outsourcing. It's a question with whether it is demand-led or supply-led, whether it's something which is organic, which is something which is linked to the actual training needs, and somebody who is completely applied mind, his mind or her mind, and tries to address the gaps. That's the response. Yeah.
Okay, so this whole content question and this whole outsourcing part of it brings me to another question, which also links back to the first discussion we had on the impact of capacity building efforts and so on. And I'm just wondering, anything from your experience on how leaders of capacity building institutions could do things differently. And I'm sure there are moments of self-doubt that individuals experience, wondering whether all the effort that they have put in is realizing the effect, is realizing the stuff that was supposed to happen. And how do people engage with that? So two parts to the question, essentially. One is about how do you engage with your own self-doubts about the results capacity building efforts are developing? And two, how do we do things differently to deliver more meaningful results as leaders of capacity building institutions?
So I think I'm getting messages that we are slightly towards the end of time. So I'll try to be brief in answering this question. And this also links with another question that was given that, well, there was a capacity building and let's about gender and resulted into something in Kerala, but not at other places. So there is that self-doubt, or let's say whether my capacity building program is resulting into a certain outcome or not. And if not, why not? So those are questions which always confront us. But I would say, well, it's not something which is not there or not to be confronted. This is the question which is there with all of us. And we do improvise, we go back to drawing board each time, and then we try to revisit our lesson plans, our whole module plans, and see what is fitting, what is not fitting. If you look at the whole, we have the week-wise module plans for the whole training in Asuri Academy. If you compare it with what was being taught 5 years ago, you will see a sea change. Content also in the methods, also into a way of different pedagogy, etc. So everything changes. Question whether it will result into certain tangible outcomes in the field, whether it will happen for everybody. No, it will not happen for everybody. Well, whether it will be result to tangible outcomes, sometimes yes, sometimes not. We have to take our chances. But I can see a pattern. I should look for the patterns. What is working over time? So that is where the question comes. What can make it? How do we? What can we do differently? So obviously we have to see as to what is that which is working, and there has to be a back and forth. There has to be clear, let's say, openness on part of me as a leader to be able to learn from my trainees, to have those informal conversations that I used to have with my trainees in the evening. And they will say, sir, this particular, he was a wonderful person, but kuch hua nahi, sir. I didn't gain much out of this. Why? Because he was talking about his experiences. He was not talking about what I need. So one more thing that I have found, again, through experimentation, is that, well, I was looking at where learning happens most. So let's say if I have to taught by a great professor from, let's say, Howard, is that where the most learning will happen? Or my being taught by somebody who has worked in a municipality for 10 years at the ground level. This person will give me more knowledge, or somebody who has just done UPP 2 years back, he will be able to give me better learning. So I suspect, or I feel that uh, generally speaking, if the distance between the learner and the person who is teaching is a lot, is greater in terms of, let's say, authority, or in terms of it's a knowledge also. If it's a huge distance, that doesn't necessarily does not lead to better learning. One of the models that I found best working for me was try to create a learning cycle between a person taught and that, for example, as far as you're mentioning that I was a student also and a teacher also. That worked very well for me. So I could engage with them in a very interesting manner, and they didn't have the apprehension, or let's say the reluctance, or let's say fear that he's a great teacher, I cannot ask questions, stupid questions, and I will be judged. So that does not happen. There's a lot of free conversation which happens. So that's one thing. And second aspect which has worked for me individually is the experiential training, learning. That has resulted in a lot of difference in the field level. So I would have taught, let's say, 100 sessions, the sessions which stuck with people after 4 years, 5 years. So I'm in Varanasi. So when I go back to some of the trainees who are there in Varanasi, who are right now posted here in municipality or in development authority. So when I converse with them, they do say that things which were experiential in nature, they went through experience. It does not mean that they actually did the thing, but things which they perceived in an experiential manner, that stayed with them. And the third aspect, important aspect, is everybody wants individualized learning. And what has happened is that technology has changed a lot of things in training. So now we can make it more individualized. This has happened, especially we partner with EPOD, Evidence-Based Policy Design of HKS. So they created some modules for us which were individualized in nature. So basically, when I take that module, it was a hybrid module. So it will give me content and the questions based on my way of learning, my level of learning. And then there was a follow-up session in terms of hybrid session. That follow-up session, again, that came out to be wonderfully well. So in the follow-up question, we came back with the data from the online session, which was again individualized in nature. And then we could focus on things where there were gaps in understanding of most people. So that has helped. So I said three things. One is individualized learning. Second, I told about that openness to learn from everybody, including teacher and taught. And third is experiential part. There are three things that have worked for me. And I do not say that they are the tenets of truth, they are the only truth, but that's something that has worked for me. Hopefully it will work for others also.
Okay, so I see that we are running terribly out of time, but I just had a couple of reflections to add on what you said before we close. Several years ago, I was doing this work in Maharashtra in the water sector. And we were talking to individuals on how the World Bank project would be framed. And it was most amazing how we came across a section of engineers who had worked on older, about a decade ago. They had worked on the ODA, what was then called ODA is now called FCDO. It was called DFID in between. They had worked years ago on ODA projects, and they remembered still some of the concepts that they had learned on, say, water resource management, on aspects of gender and sort of financial sustainability, operational sustainability, and so on. They had not had the opportunity to use that learning in their parent department, so not the full opportunity to use that, but they still retained a lot of it. And this was particularly striking. I mean, it conveys the fact that while we talk about capacity development efforts not realizing their full potential and so on because of institutional constraints, etc., and it is true, what we must also understand is that some of the seeds that are sown are there and they remain. and they offer actually a platform for later to be built on. That's one. The second thing is, we talked about a certain restlessness that, we did this training, or we went through this effort, and a little bit of frustration about the fact that we are not able to use that in our sort of operating context. To me, that frustration is, obviously it's worrisome and it should be addressed, but it's not necessarily a completely bad thing, because there's also a signal there that it has created a certain sort of, it has alerted individuals to the promise of what can be done better. And that's an important thing in itself. And thirdly, and like you said, there are many who go through these efforts and so on, and they step out into the field and do wondrous work. So there is a mix of all these circumstances, but essentially the larger point is that we started off with a provocation about the great training waste and robbery and so on, but I think there is plenty that we should be optimistic about, and that unlike one of the panelists in the other set in the previous session was saying, that this needs to be an ongoing effort. We obviously need to do things better. We obviously need to make sure that the institutional and the leadership, well, the institutional conditions in particular, which is somewhat a little more controllable, I suppose, need to be addressed to help realize things better on ground. But yeah, there's good reason to be optimistic, and I suppose that's a nice note to close the session on. Yeah. So thanks, Vidya. Thanks for joining us, and I'll pass on the baton to Aishwarya once again.
Thank you, Vidya, for bringing up all these insightful points about capacity development for building leadership, engaging actively with our audience, and more importantly, making time for us today. We know you're busy and you've gone out of your way to accommodate us. We're so grateful for you being here for the Urban Practitioners Program and IIHS whenever we've reached out to you. Thank you so much. We look forward to engaging with you more and more. Thanks.
Thank you, Aishwarya. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I would have loved to be there in person, but unfortunately, I'm not able to.
Sure.
And I would be happy to answer any other questions offline through emails, etc. If you could share my email ID with them, and I would invite questions. I couldn't answer all the questions and couldn't answer all the questions fully. Some to my limitations of understanding, some to limitation of my time. But thank you all. Thank you for listening to me, and thank you, Aishwarya, for inviting us. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Vidya. Thank you. Thanks, Manish. Bye. Over to Shubha Muthukumar for closing with a vote of thanks.
So thank you, Aishwarya. Thanks, Manish and Vidya, for giving a insight on the leadership roles, what the future people has to play on this. It's a very great discussion today. We had it the day one and day two, highlighted a lot of concept. I thank all the speakers and the panelists who have come here and shared their thoughts individually, organizationally, as well as a lot of takeaways, a lot of failures, a lot of also we have to gain a knowledge on how the capacity building should work it. I take a three concepts which is very seriously discussed yesterday and today. Yesterday it was more stressed on, Raru was stressing that outcomes and based is not approachable. So we have to be think on very clearly that what is the objective we are saying for the capacity building. And the speakers exclusively in the learners perspective, what Aishwarya was curating it, they have given it the mentorship and the coaching is going to be a lead for the future. That's one thing which they have been formatted. So I think that's a way of going it. And one of the second discussions, we had different panels, which they are stressed on the competency mapping, whether really the organization is doing properly or not. And also people are thinking on the practice plus the project-oriented development capacity building, which also imbibe the knowledges. And today's discussion is very great, like two panels have a very great discussion. I want to pick up one of a word which was given by Anand, that many to many, any to many approach. It's a great thing because, we have to do like a community-wise training, not an individual only, because many to many and any to many. And another one, which the important thing the panel has brought, that very important thing that the phase-wise delivery platforms which we have to evaluate, because that's become how we are going to nurture ourselves as well as the organization, whether grown with this impact or not. And the other one, which was given by Anand also, like PMO is planning for HR council advisory. So I think the capacity building will get strengthened more on this. So these three are the very important takeaways which we thought it. And from the Geeta Krishnan panel, I understand that the digital blend in learning is going to have a very, even after the post-pandemic or even this COVID is going to finish it, so it's going to have a very great sequence on this. So the hybrid learning is going to make. And regarding the final session with the leadership, the thought has given to us that, the leadership, how we take the leadership role, how we are going to sensitize the people in a capacity building. Sometimes there is a failure, sometimes there is a success story. So we have to demarcate in both, and then we want to try it out on this actually. So once again, I thank all the speakers, all the panelists being for this, and I thank internally our IIHS team who have been supported this event to be a grand success, to take it forward. And then I also thank the participants who have been in a different climatic regions. They have been joining, as well as they have been joined with a different type of an industrials, as well as the capacity building training entity. So there is a different type of heterogeneous group, I can say it. So I thank one and all, and we can meet for the next series. It's going to be happen every year. We take your critical points, we take your advices on this to make it more lively, and we will also understand the end user feedback in this 1 year time, what the capacity building we improved ourselves as a training entity, as a knowledge gainer, as a leadership roles, what we are playing it. So thank you one and all. I thank everyone to be there, and then we can close this discussion further. Thank you one and all.
Thank you.